"Your mailbox is illegal, and I'll keep running it over until you fix it." Those were the exact words that came out of Karen Monroe's mouth, our self-appointed HOA queen, as she stood in my driveway with that smug little smirk. I thought she was joking, who openly admits to destroying federal property with their own SUV, but the evidence was undeniable. 3 times in a single month, my mailbox had been flattened, shattered, and left in pieces, and now the culprit wasn't a mystery anymore. It was the woman who lived 2 streets over the one who wielded HOA rules like weapons and believed no one could stand up to her. That night, staring at the broken remains of my mailbox, something inside me shifted. If Karen wanted to play demolition derby with my property, I'd play back, but on my terms. And what I built next would become more than a mailbox. It would be a fortress. Before we dive into this insane battle, drop a comment below, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The first time it happened, I thought it was bad luck. The second time, I figured maybe some careless delivery driver clipped it. But the third time I knew something wasn't right. My mailbox wasn't just dented, it was obliterated. Twisted metal, splintered post letters scattered across my lawn like confetti after a parade. The kind of damage you don't get from a random bump, you get it when someone floors the gas and makes sure there's nothing left standing. I was standing there with a handful of crushed envelopes when I spotted it. A neon pink slip stuck to my front porch railing, fluttering in the breeze like it was mocking me. Notice of violation, non-compliant mailbox. Immediate replacement required. HOA Regulation 7.3.4. I laughed out loud, but it wasn't the funny kind of laugh. More like the "I can't believe this is happening" kind. That's when I remembered what my neighbor, Mrs. Harris, had whispered to me 2 weeks earlier. She had seen Karen Monroe, the president of Cedar Glen HOA, back her gleaming white SUV right into my old mailbox, glance around, and then drive off as if nothing had happened. At the time, I thought Mrs. Harris might have been mistaken. After all, who in their right mind admits to felony vandalism just to prove a point about HOA rules? But now the puzzle pieces were fitting together, and the picture was ugly. By the time I calmed down enough to read the violation slip properly, my hands were trembling. It listed a replacement deadline of 7 days and threatened a $25 daily fine if I didn't comply. On top of that, a removal fee of $150 was already tacked onto my account. Imagine that Karen destroys my property with her own bumper, then has the audacity to fine me for it. If that doesn't scream abuse of power, I don't know what does. I marched inside, tossed the pink slip onto my kitchen counter, and dialed the HOA office. Of course, the HOA office was basically Karen's personal voicemail. She never answered in person. She liked the power play of calling back on her own schedule, as if homeowners were supposed to wait at her convenience. I left a message anyway, my voice cold. "This is Dr. Marcus Hale, 214, Cedar Glen Drive. My mailbox has been destroyed again. I found your violation notice. Call me back immediately, we're going to have a serious conversation." I didn't expect her to call right away, but 20 minutes later, as I sat on my back porch nursing a beer, my phone buzzed. Caller ID, Karen Monroe. I let it ring twice just to remind myself I wasn't at her beck and call, then picked up. "Dr. Hale," she said, her tone syrupy but sharp underneath. "I assume you got the notice." "Oh, I got it," I said. "Along with the destroyed mailbox, you conveniently forgot to mention in your little violation slip." Karen didn't even flinch. "Your mailbox was non-compliant. Oversized, painted black, no brass accents. It posed a risk to the uniformity of the neighborhood. HOA regulations require removal." "Removal?" I snapped. "You mean you running it over 3 times with your SUV? Because Mrs. Harris saw you. And I'm guessing the dent in your bumper matches the wreckage in my yard." She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Dr. Hale, I can't be held responsible for where I drive. If your mailbox was in compliance, maybe it wouldn't have been in the way." My grip tightened on the phone. "That's not how this works. A mailbox is federal property once installed for USPS delivery. Destroying it is a federal offense. Do you understand that?" There was a pause. Then her voice shifted into that sing-songy tone she used when she wanted to remind people she held the power. "Rules are rules, doctor. You signed the covenant when you bought your home. If you don't like it, maybe Cedar Glen isn't the right neighborhood for you." And then click. She hung up on me. I stared at the phone for a long minute, my jaw clenched so tight I thought my molars might crack. That's when Frank Dalton, my neighbor across the street, strolled over. Frank was a retired Marine, the kind of guy who wore cargo shorts year-round and always carried a folding chair in the bed of his pickup just in case. He nodded at the mess on my lawn. "Karen," he asked simply. "Karen," I confirmed. Frank spat into the grass. "Figures. She's been gunning for you since you fought her on those garden lights last year. She doesn't like anyone who pushes back. Yeah, well, I said, kicking a piece of twisted metal. She picked the wrong guy this time. Frank grinned. Good. About time someone gave her hell. That night, instead of watching TV or catching up on medical journals like I usually did after a shift, I sat at my dining table with a yellow legal pad and the HOA covenant binder I dug out of a closet. If Karen wanted to fight me with rules, I'd drown her in them. The covenant was 123 pages of small print misery, but buried in section 14. 2 was exactly what I needed. All violation notices must be delivered in writing physically, and homeowners must be allowed a 14-day cure period before enforcement. I hadn't received any written notice prior to my mailbox's sudden removal. That alone made her actions unlawful under HOA's own rules. But it got better. A quick search through federal law, thank you Google, turned up 18 U.S.C. Section 1705, which states, whoever willfully or maliciously injures, tears down, or destroys any letterbox or other receptacle intended or used for the receipt or delivery of mail shall be fined or imprisoned up to 3 years. So not only was Karen breaking her own HOA rules, she was stepping into felony territory. Suddenly the power dynamics didn't look so one-sided. Still, I knew I couldn't just walk into the next HOA meeting, wave a printout of federal law, and expect Karen to crumble. People like her didn't crack under pressure, they doubled down. If I wanted to win, I needed more than rules. I needed a plan, something so ironclad, so undeniable that even Karen couldn't spin her way out of it. I looked back at the mangled heap of metal outside my window, and that's when the idea struck me. If she wanted to destroy my mailbox, fine, I'd build one she couldn't touch, a fortress, a monument, something that made a mockery of her power and turned every one of her petty attacks into a joke. I spent the rest of the evening sketching out ideas, jotting down notes, even pricing steel reinforcement posts online. My heart pounded with equal parts rage and excitement. This wasn't just about mail anymore. This was about drawing a line in the sand, about telling Karen Monroe that her reign of terror ended here on my front lawn. Because here's the thing about people like Karen, they thrive when no one stands up to them. They live off intimidation, off making everyone else roll their eyes and mutter but never take action. But the moment someone fights back publicly, loudly, and with receipts, that's when their empire starts to crumble. And I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to humiliate her. I didn't march to Karen's front door because I wanted drama. I marched because somebody had just committed theft and felony vandalism in broad daylight, and the idea that the same person could turn up at my mailbox the next week and do it, again without consequence, made my skin crawl. Her house sat on the corner like it was carved out of entitlement, a beige McMansion with perfectly trimmed hedges and a flagpole that never failed to sport whatever civic virtue was trending that month. Her SUV was in the driveway vanity plate, blazing Hoboss like a banner announcing the monarch. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and walked up the path. When she opened the screen door, I almost laughed at the theatricality of it. Karen Monroe, in her power blazer, a blazer that looked like it could iron itself, smiled the way tyrants smile when their teeth meet. "Dr. Hale," she purred. "What can I help you with? What can you help me with?" I repeated. "How about explaining why my mailbox has been run over 3 times in 4 weeks?" She tilted her head like a woman considering a delicious rumor. "Your mailbox was non-compliant. Oversized, wrong finish, and frankly unbecoming to the community aesthetic. We issued a notice." "You issued a notice by running it over," I said. I held up the neon pink slip and watched her expression glint for a second, amused, then practiced. "Mrs. Harris told me she saw you back your vehicle into it. She can confirm." Karen's smile thinned. "Mrs. Harris is prone to exaggeration. We have standards in Cedar Glen. You signed the covenant, Dr. Hale. We enforce it." The conversation could have ended there. For most people it would. But I had that section bookmarked, the tiny paragraph in the covenant that said notices had to be delivered physically and homeowners had to be granted a cure period. I also had something that mattered more than paper. A crew of witnesses who'd seen Karen treat rules like a sport and neighbors who wouldn't stand by quietly anymore. So I pushed. "If you sent a written notice, produce it," I said. "Not an email, not a broadcast. A delivered notice. The covenant says 14 days to cure before enforcement." She tapped a perfectly manicured fingernail against the doorframe. "We sent notices electronically." The board voted, "You can't substitute an email for a written notice when the covenant explicitly requires delivery," I cut in. "And the mailbox is federal property once put into use for postal delivery. If someone tampers with it, that's beyond HOA jurisdiction." For a heartbeat, I saw something like panic flicker across her face and then a recalibration. "You're being dramatic," she said. "This is about uniformity. Get it fixed and we'll move on." Behind her on the porch, a man I'd never seen before, a trim fellow carrying a clipboard, shifted his weight. I later learned he was one of her board cronies, the type who nodded politely at meetings and wrote down enforcement actions like confessions in a ledger. He didn't say anything now, but his presence felt like a ledger closing. I left her doorstep with a quiet promise in my chest. I was not going to let this be one person's shrug and smirk. But I also didn't want to make a public scene without evidence. That meant I had to build a case that would hold up in a meeting room in the postmaster's office, and if it came to that in a courtroom, evidence, not just indignation. The first place I went was Mrs. Harris's little bungalow. She was waiting on her porch with a thermos and a look that could cut through mansions. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. I saw her, Marcus. She backed in, slow, looked around like she was checking witnesses, then went for it. "Slow?" I asked. "Deliberate," she corrected. That woman hates anything that's not exactly her idea of perfect. Mrs. Harris provided more than anecdote. She showed me a shaky video she'd taken on her phone a week earlier when Karen had been inspecting another neighbor's mailbox. The clip was short license plate, close SUV, shuttering a vague view of a mailbox getting clipped. Not the ideal courtroom quality, but it was something. It put a face and motion to the act. That afternoon, I went door to door. People who'd muttered about Karen at garden clubs suddenly unmuted when I started asking specific questions. A kid from 2 houses down had a GoPro slung on his bike and had captured Karen's SUV idling near my property that afternoon. Mr. Ruiz, the neighbor with the ornamental gnome statue, who'd once been fined for their gnome's unauthorized stature, admitted he'd seen Karen back into my mailbox the 3rd time and then drive away as if nothing had happened. Witnesses weren't miracles, but they were concrete. They were neighbors willing to step up and say what they'd seen. I also called the post office. The voice on the other end was bored and helpful in equal measure. "We can hold your mail," the clerk said, "but interference with mailboxes, if that's occurring, can be a federal matter. You should document everything, and if you think a crime's been committed, file a complaint with the postal inspector." That was the confirmation I needed. This wasn't just HOA drama. It crossed a line where federal statutes lived. Armed with witness statements, shaky but telling videos, and the clause in the covenant, I started to assemble a packet. I typed a formal letter to the board that would make even a bureaucrat scoff, a crisp outline of events, dates, times, mentions of the covenant clause, about written notice, copies of the violation slips, and a polite but firm note that I expected restitution for the removal fee, and an immediate cessation of any further unilateral enforcement. I CC'd the postmaster and the postal inspector's office, not as an idle threat, but because a chain of custody often matters more than a chain of threats. At dusk, Frank knocked on my door with a cooler of beers and an armful of something else, a rugged pair of binoculars and the promise of backup. "If we have to catch her in the act," he said, "I'll watch from my porch and you call me." We turned a slow-brewing grievance into a small operation. 4 of us, me, Frank, Mrs. Harris, and Mr. Ruiz, coordinated shifts. We weren't spies, but we were a neighborhood that had had enough. We set times to be on the lookout, swapped clips, and shared notes. It felt oddly communal, the kind of grassroots civic engagement usually reserved for school fundraisers and block parties. Except this time, the prize was accountability. But the more I gathered evidence, the more I realized this wouldn't be just evidence collection. It was a test: would others in Cedar Glen step into the light or retreat into the comfort of passive gossip? In the week that followed, more people started sharing stories. A basketball hoop removal here, a garage door, fine there, small injustices that piled together painted a picture of selective enforcement. I compiled those anecdotes into a dossier: dates, names, the petty fines, the inconsistently applied rules. All of it would go in the packet I planned to present at the next HOA meeting. Public pressure mattered in an HOA because HOs were run by volunteers sensitive to neighbors' opinions, or at least sensitive to embarrassment. A woman who liked to rule by fear didn't like to be called out in front of a room full of retirees and working folks who suddenly realized they too might have been played. That night I slept fitfully. Part anger, part strategy. I knew escalation could make Karen lash out, and I didn't want to be reckless. But I also knew how these things ended: silence, payments, apologies that dissolved by Tuesday. Not this time. Not when my evidence was stacking up and my neighborhood was waking up from polite complicity. Before turning out the light, I scribbled a quick note to myself: document, witnesses, postal inspector, build the mailbox they can't touch. It read like a plan for revenge, which maybe it was, but the revenge I wanted had a civic stripe. It was about restoring some sense of fairness, about making it clear that rules applied to everyone, especially to the women who made a hobby of enforcing them selectively. The next morning I had 3 new messages in my inbox. One was from the HOA board curt and formal requesting I attend the monthly meeting to discuss community standards. Another was from Karen's husband, oddly apologetic, asking if we could talk this over privately. The third was from a local handyman who'd seen my social media post about installing a reinforced post. He said he had access to a heavy-duty steel support if I wanted it. Sometimes a neighborhood dispute turns into a legal tangle. Sometimes it cools into silence. I had a feeling ours would become a small revolution. I just didn't yet know how many people would show up for the uprising. The HOA covenant binder lay sprawled across my dining room table like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Its pages smelled faintly of mildew and bureaucracy, each paragraph more soul-crushing than the last. Yet buried in the endless legal jargon was my salvation. I highlighted the section again just to be sure. All violation notices must be delivered in writing physically, and homeowners shall be granted 14 days to cure before enforcement action is taken. 14 days. Physical notice. Not an email. Not a whisper campaign. Not Karen's SUV. For the first time in weeks I smiled, because that clause wasn't ambiguous, it was ironclad. And Karen had trampled it with all the subtlety of her front tires crushing my mailbox. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too early. HOAs thrive on intimidation and technicalities. They use words like uniformity and aesthetic cohesion to mask what they're really doing, controlling every inch of your property. Karen was the queen of this game, and if I wanted to beat her, I needed more than one line from a covenant. I needed backup, legal, federal, and neighborly. That's when I turned to federal law. A quick search pulled up 18 U.S.C. Section 1705, the statute that makes destroying or tampering with a mailbox a felony, punishable by fines and up to 3 years in prison. 3 years. Imagine Karen Monroe, the self-anointed HOA monarch, trading her designer blazers for an orange jumpsuit. The thought was almost too sweet. But federal law, I knew, doesn't always swoop down to rescue the little guy. They'd want evidence, documentation, patterns, and that's where my neighbors came in. The next day I set up shop at Frank Dalton's front porch. Frank had already become my unofficial ally. He leaned back in his lawn chair, sipping iced tea like he was watching maneuvers from a command post. "You've got the law," he said, "but you need witnesses. People Karen can't bully into silence." So we made a list. Mrs. Harris had already seen Karen back into my mailbox. Mr. Ruiz had watched her drive off after the 3rd accident. And then there were others, the quiet ones who'd suffered but never spoken out. Frank was right. This wasn't just about me. This was about years of unchecked power. I spent the afternoon knocking on doors. Some residents were cautious at first. They spoke in lowered voices, glancing over their shoulders like Karen might be eavesdropping through the hedges. But once I shared my story, their grievances poured out like water from a burst dam. One neighbor had been fined for planting non-compliant tulips. Another had her birdbath removed because it was supposedly too tall. The Johnson kids weren't allowed to keep their basketball hoop because recreational equipment visible from the street violated aesthetic standards. Each story added fuel to my fire. Each one proved that Karen's crusade wasn't about rules, it was about control. I recorded their statements in a notebook, scribbling furiously. By sundown, I had 8 first-hand accounts of selective enforcement, and the look on my neighbors' faces when they finally spoke out, it was relief. Like someone had finally cracked open a window in a suffocating room. That night, I compiled everything into a folder I titled Operation Mailbox Fortress. Inside went the highlighted covenant clause, the federal statute, and every neighbor's statement. I even included screenshots from a local Facebook group where Karen had bragged about keeping the neighborhood in line. She'd commented under one post, "Some people think the rules don't apply to them, but around here compliance isn't optional." Perfect. Straight from the tyrant's mouth. Still, part of me wanted more than paperwork. I wanted something physical, something Karen couldn't destroy no matter how hard she tried. That's when I fell down the rabbit hole of tamper-proof mailboxes. Did you know there's an entire industry dedicated to making mailboxes that can survive everything short of a nuclear blast? I didn't until I found myself scrolling through websites at 2 a.m., jaw hanging open at models boasting things like resists, sledgehammers, axes, even gunfire. There it was, the Fort Knox mailbox. 1/4-inch steel, 80 pounds of indestructible glory, mounted on a post that could be encased in concrete like the foundation of a small house. It came in several colors, but when I saw forest green with brass accents, I nearly laughed. Karen's own regulations had demanded that exact shade. She wanted uniformity. I'd give her uniformity. Uniformity in the form of a mailbox that could outlast her presidency. The price tag stung $350 plus shipping. But I reminded myself Karen had already fined me $150 for removal she caused. Add the daily penalty they threatened, and this fortress would pay for itself in a month. Besides, peace of mind is priceless. Before ordering, I called the company to confirm one detail: dimensions. If Karen wanted to nitpick, I wanted no loopholes. The rep chuckled. It's the same external size as a standard mailbox, sir. Just heavier. You could hit it with a truck, and it wouldn't budge. Music to my ears. I'll take it, I said. But a mailbox fortress requires a foundation, and for that I needed muscle. So I rang my buddy Mike, who owned a concrete company. Mike, I said, how would you like to help me install a mailbox that could survive World War III? His laugh boomed through the phone. Sounds like you finally crossed paths with that HOA psycho Frank told me about. Don't worry, we'll bury that post so deep it'll be easier to move your house than your mailbox. We set a date for Friday. 3 days to prepare. 3 days to let Karen stew in the knowledge that I wasn't caving. Meanwhile, I consulted another ally, my old law school friend Lynn Chen, now a property dispute attorney. I emailed her the covenant, the violation notice, and the photos of my destroyed mailbox. She called me back within the hour. Marcus, she said, this is textbook overreach. They can regulate the style, sure. But physically removing, or in this case destroying your mailbox without proper notice, that's unlawful. And if you can prove it, you've got grounds for damages. Can they make me replace it with their approved model, I asked. As long as your mailbox meets the color and style requirements, they can't say no, she replied. Brand names aren't enforceable unless the covenant specifies them explicitly. From what I see, it doesn't. That was the golden ticket. Karen couldn't argue with federal law. She couldn't argue with her own covenant. And she sure as hell couldn't argue with a mailbox that looked HOA compliant but was built like a bank vault. The next step was rallying my witnesses. I created a group chat and jokingly named it Karen's Victims Support Group. Within minutes, the replies rolled in. Mrs. Harris, about time someone stood up to her. Frank, I've got beer and binoculars ready. Mr. Ruiz, I'll bring my camera. This is better than Netflix. It felt less like a support group and more like a militia forming. And that gave me an idea. If Karen tried anything when we installed the new mailbox, we'd document it from every angle. Witnesses, video timestamps. She wouldn't just be facing me, she'd be facing the whole block. The following morning, I walked past the wreckage of my old mailbox and imagined the fortress that would soon stand in its place. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, I felt the balance of power shift. Karen thought she had me cornered with fines and regulations. But soon she'd be the one cornered by her own rules, by federal law, and by a mailbox that refused to bow. Because sometimes the best way to beat tyranny isn't with shouting or fists. Sometimes it's with steel concrete, and a plan so ironclad it leaves your opponent sputtering. And I couldn't wait to see Karen sputter. Friday arrived with the kind of Texas heat that makes the asphalt ripple like water, but for me it felt like game day. The Fort Knox mailbox had been delivered the night before, dropped on my driveway by a delivery man who muttered, "What the hell do you have in here, Bricks?" while straining with his dolly. I just grinned and said, "Something better." Mike pulled up at 8 sharp with his work truck rattling like a tank. 2 of his crew hopped out, one carrying a cement mixer attachment, the other hauling rebar. Frank was already stationed across the street in his lawn chair, binoculars slung around his neck, a cooler full of beer at his side. "Best entertainment in months," he hollered. I didn't even have to invite the neighbors, they came on their own. Mrs. Harris brought a folding stool and her ever-present thermos. The Ruiz family stood on the curb, whispering and chuckling like kids sneaking candy before dinner. Even shy Mrs. Whitaker, who rarely left her porch, came out with her little dog in tow. They weren't just here for spectacle, they were witnesses. And witnesses are the currency of justice when you're dealing with someone like Karen. Mike clapped his hands together, grinning. "All right, Doc, where do you want your bunker planted?" I pointed to the sad, splintered hole where my old mailbox had once stood. "Right there. But this time I want it to be the last hole we ever dig." The men laughed, but when the digging started, the mood shifted from humor to determination. They carved into the earth, widening and deepening the hole until it looked less like a mailbox post and more like the foundation of a monument. Sweat-dripped concrete dust coated our boots, and the sun beat down mercilessly, but there was something exhilarating about it. Every shovel of dirt felt like rebellion, every mix of concrete, a declaration we weren't bowing to tyranny anymore. Mike showed me the reinforced steel post he'd brought. 3 feet deep, encased in enough concrete to hold a small skyscraper. If anyone wants to move this thing, they better bring a backhoe. Perfect. As the concrete poured in thick gray waves, neighbors snapped pictures, giggling like conspirators at a heist. I could almost feel Karen's eyes from across the subdivision, though her curtains stayed closed that morning. Maybe she didn't know yet. Or maybe she was waiting for the right moment to swoop in and try to stop it. Either way, I welcomed it. I wanted her to see what we were building. By noon, the post stood straight, anchored in its tomb of concrete. We set the massive mailbox on top. Forest green, brass numbers polished until they gleamed. Every inch perfectly aligned with HOA regulations. On paper, it was compliant. In reality, it was a fortress. 80 pounds of steel and spite welded together. When the last bolt was tightened, the crowd actually clapped. It wasn't just for the mailbox, it was for the small act of defiance, the proof that someone could stand up to Karen and win. Doc Frank called out, raising his can in salute. "I think you just built the first indestructible HOA-approved mailbox in Travis County." "Correction," I replied, grinning, "the first Karen-proof mailbox." The laughter that rippled across the street felt better than any fine Karen could slap me with. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the neighborhood gold, I set up a small hidden security camera in the oak tree near the curb. Its lens pointed squarely at the mailbox, waiting for the inevitable. Because Karen wouldn't be able to resist, she'd circle like a shark, measuring tape in hand, searching for flaws. And when she did, I'd have her on video. I didn't have to wait long. At precisely 9:07 the next morning, Karen was nothing if not predictable. Her SUV crawled down the street like a predator stalking prey. I stood behind my blinds, phone recording in hand, as she stopped in front of my driveway. She reversed, idled, then slowly pulled up again as though circling the kill. Finally, she parked, heels clicking as she stepped out, armed with a tape measure and clipboard. I nearly laughed watching her performance. She crouched low, measuring the height from curb to box. She extended the tape across the width, checked the setback distance, even pulled out a small level to ensure it wasn't tilted. Then came the real show. Karen pressed her hands against the side and shoved. Nothing. She kicked the base with her shoe. Still nothing. And when she finally leaned her full weight against it, the mailbox didn't so much as tremble. The camera caught it all, the scowl spreading across her face, the twitch in her jaw, the way she muttered under her breath like a villain in a cartoon. She scribbled furiously on her clipboard, snapped a few pictures with her phone, and stormed back to her SUV. Seconds later, my group chat lit up. "Mrs. Harris. She's out there measuring like a madwoman, Frank. She just tried to body slam the thing. Mailbox wins. Mr. Ruiz. She looks like she swallowed a lemon." I couldn't stop smiling. Round one, me. But Karen wasn't the type to take defeat quietly. By that afternoon, a white pickup with Cedar Glen Maintenance painted on the side rolled up. 2 men got out, looked at the mailbox, exchanged a glance, and then one of them burst out laughing. "Is this thing steel?" he muttered, tapping it with his knuckles. I walked out casually, hands in my pockets. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" They both shook their heads, one still chuckling. "Nope, it's within code. Just sturdier than usual." They climbed back in the truck and drove off, leaving me with a grin so wide it hurt. That night, I allowed myself a rare luxury sleep without stress. No replaying Karen's smug voice in my head, no worrying about another smashed mailbox. Just the quiet hum of cicadas outside my window, and the knowledge that for once the battlefield wasn't tilted in her favor. But peace never lasts long when you live under a petty tyrant. The very next evening, Karen returned, this time with reinforcements. Her husband, a meek man I'd only ever seen trimming hedges, stood beside her holding what looked like a giant pipe wrench. Behind them was the head of the maintenance crew, clearly summoned as backup. I stepped onto my porch, pretending to check my tomato plants. "Evening, folks. Can I help you with something?" Karen jumped slightly, then straightened her blazer, plastering on a smile. "Doctor, hail, your mailbox. Appears unusual." "Unusual," I echoed. "It's forest green with brass numbers. Exactly as required." Her husband shifted nervously, clutching the wrench like a child holding a toy he didn't want. The maintenance man glanced at Karen, clearly uncomfortable. Karen sniffed. "It's not the approved model. The regulations specify—" Actually, I interrupted, pulling the covenant from my pocket. "The regulations specify color and style. Not brand, not model, and mine matches perfectly. Would you like to read the clause again?" The maintenance man cleared his throat. "She's right, Mrs. Monroe. It meets the requirements." Karen's face flushed red, then white, then back to red again. She looked down at her husband, who was now trying to hide the wrench behind his leg. Were you planning to remove my mailbox again? I asked, my voice sharper now. Because that would be tampering with federal property, a felony. And just so you know, everything happening right now is being recorded. I gestured toward the oak tree, where my hidden camera blinked its little red light. Karen froze. Her husband dropped the wrench to the grass with a dull thud. And from across the street, a burst of laughter, Frank recording the entire scene on his phone while sipping a beer. The neighbors were out again, drawn to the spectacle like moths to flame. Mrs. Harris held her iPad high, capturing every second. The Ruiz kids whispered excitedly, pointing. Even Mrs. Whitaker stood at the edge of her lawn, her little dog barking furiously at Karen's retreating SUV. Ridiculous, Karen muttered, turning on her heel. This is a circus. No, I called after her loud enough for the crowd to hear. What's ridiculous is destroying someone's property and then pretending it's enforcement. What's ridiculous is thinking no one will stand up to you. She didn't answer. She climbed into her SUV, her husband scurrying after her, and peeled off down the street tires, squealing just enough to betray her temper. The moment she was gone, the neighbors broke into applause. Real honest applause. It wasn't just for me. It was for themselves, for the fact that someone had finally called Karen out and won. As I stood there watching the sunset paint the street orange and pink, I realized something. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore. It was about power, about who got to wield it and whether we were willing to live under it. And Karen, whether she knew it or not, had just lost her grip on Cedar Glen. The Monday after Karen's failed inspection felt like the first day of a new era. I'd taken the day off work partly to recover from the grueling week of stress, but mostly because I knew she wouldn't be able to resist another round. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She was the type to double down until she drove herself into the ground. I brewed a strong pot of coffee, sat in my living room with the blinds angled just enough to give me a clear view of the street, and waited. Sure enough, at precisely 9:00 a.m., her SUV came rolling down the block like a shark circling its prey. This time she didn't even try to be subtle. She slammed on the brakes in front of my house, threw the car into reverse, and pulled into my driveway as though she owned it. My phone was already recording through the window, but I slipped out the back door and circled around to meet her head-on. She was out of the SUV heels, clicking on my concrete clipboard, tucked under one arm, a brand-new tape measure dangling from the other, and she wasn't alone. The entire HOA board trailed behind her like ducklings behind their mother, hen, 4 men, and 1 woman, each looking like they'd rather be anywhere else but too afraid to defy her. Well, well, I said, leaning casually against my porch rail. Looks like we're having an unannounced field trip. Karen ignored me, striding up to the mailbox with a flourish. She extended the tape, measured the height again, measured the distance from the curb, even crouched down and checked the bolts at the base. This mailbox, she declared loudly enough for the neighbors who'd already started peeking from behind curtains to hear, is non-compliant. Non-compliant, how I asked. It is not the approved colonial elegance model. Section 7.3.4 specifies uniformity. I shook my head and pulled a folded, highlighted copy of the covenant from my back pocket. Section 7.3.4 specifies color and style. Forest green with brass numbers. That's exactly what you're looking at. If you wanted to regulate brands, you should have amended the covenant. Until then, you don't get to invent rules on the spot. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a balding man named Bill Ortega, who I knew had once practiced law, leaned toward Karen and whispered something. Her lips pinched. She didn't like being contradicted, especially not in public. Karen straightened. Regardless, this mailbox is clearly designed to intimidate. It is excessively fortified. It creates an atmosphere of hostility. I laughed out loud. Hostility? It's a mailbox, Karen. Not a guard tower. If you find it intimidating, maybe that says more about you than it does about me. Frank had pulled up another lawn chair by now, waving to the growing audience across the street. She's losing it, he yelled, earning chuckles from the Ruiz kids who were filming the entire exchange. Karen's face turned the shade of overripe tomatoes. She snapped her fingers at one of the board members. Document this, she ordered. We'll issue a secondary violation. Careful, I said smoothly. Because if you issue another violation without cause, I'll be forwarding everything, including this little spectacle, to the postal inspector. And remember, interfering with mail delivery is a federal offense. The last time you touched my mailbox, you broke the law. Do you really want to explain that in front of a judge? That shut her up. For the first time, Karen's voice faltered. We'll revisit this at the next board meeting. Excellent, I said, grinning. I'll see you there. And I'll be bringing copies of everything for all our neighbors. She whipped around, nearly tripping on her own heels as she stormed back to her SUV. The board members shuffled after her like prisoners being marched back to their cells. The crowd of neighbors burst into applause again, louder this time. I raised my coffee mug in salute. To the indestructible mailbox, I said, and the laughter that followed rolled down the street like a wave. The board meeting came 3 days later, held in the beige, stucco community center that smelled perpetually of old carpet and burnt coffee. Usually these meetings drew fewer than 20 residents, mostly retirees, with nothing better to do. But that night the place was packed. Word had spread fast about the mailbox rebellion. I walked in with my folder of evidence, the Covenant clutched under one arm. Frank flanked me like security detail missus. Harris toted her iPad, and the Ruiz family carried a stack of printouts of their photos. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a trial. Karen sat at the head of the long folding table flanked by the board. She banged her gavel with unnecessary force, the sound cracking through the stale air. "This meeting will come to order," she snapped. When the open forum portion began, I stood and approached the microphone. All eyes followed me. Karen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, smirk plastered on her face. "I'm here to address the illegal destruction of my mailbox," I began. Gasps and murmurs swept the room. Karen's smirk wavered. I held up the Covenant pages marked with neon tabs. Section 14.2 clearly states that violation notices must be physically delivered and homeowners given 14 days to cure before enforcement. I received no such notice. Instead, my mailbox was destroyed not once but 3 times. Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. "We placed a notice on your door. If you failed to see it, that's not the HOA's fault." I smiled. "Funny. Because my security cameras show no one approaching my door during that period. And even if you had, the law doesn't grant you the right to remove a mailbox. Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1705 makes tampering with mailboxes a felony punishable by up to 3 years in prison. Would you like me to read the section aloud?" The room went dead, silent. Karen's face drained of color. Before she could speak, I gestured toward the Ruiz kids. "I also have witnesses and photos of your SUV idling near my property the day my mailbox was destroyed. And let's not forget Mrs. Harris, who saw you back into it." Mrs. Harris stood from her seat, voice trembling but strong. "I saw it with my own eyes. You looked around to make sure no one was watching, except I was." The crowd erupted in whispers. Bill Ortega, the lawyer board member, leaned forward and whispered urgently to Karen. Her hands clenched the gavel like it was the only thing keeping her afloat. I pressed on. "This isn't just about me. This is about selective enforcement. The Petersons' mailbox is blue, not forest green, and it's never been touched. The Abernathys have house numbers stenciled on theirs, an unauthorized decoration according to the same rules you fined me for. Why haven't they been cited?" Heads turned toward the mentioned neighbors, who nodded vigorously. More murmurs filled the room. "This is a pattern," I said, "not of rule enforcement, but of harassment. And tonight, I'm formally requesting 2 things. 1, the immediate dismissal of all fines levied against me, and 2, a full review of the board's actions for selective enforcement." The applause that followed was thunderous. Karen tried to bang the gavel again, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of voices demanding answers. She shouted, "Order, order," but no one listened. Finally, Bill Ortega raised his hand. His voice was calm, steady. "I believe Dr. Hale makes a valid point. Our covenant does require written notice, and if proper procedures weren't followed, the board is at fault. Furthermore, selective enforcement is grounds for legal challenge under Texas Property Code 209. We must address this transparently." Karen's face turned the color of wet cement. She slammed the gavel one last time and hissed, "We will take this under advisement." But the damage was done. On my way out, neighbors clapped me on the back, thanked me, even hugged me. Dorothy from the next block whispered, "It's about time someone stood up to her. Last month, she made me repaint my shutters because she said the shade of green was too cheerful." As I stepped into the warm night air, the weight on my chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, Karen wasn't untouchable. For the first time, the neighborhood had seen behind the curtain. And once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. The fallout from that HOA meeting didn't take days, it took hours. By the next morning, Cedar Glen buzzed like a hornet's nest. I couldn't step outside without a neighbor flagging me down to share their own Karen story. It felt like a dam had finally burst. For years, people had been quietly enduring her nitpicking fines and drive-by inspections. But once I stood at that microphone and laid it out in public, everyone realized they weren't alone. Still, Karen wasn't one to lick her wounds in private. She came back swinging figuratively and, as it turned out, almost literally. It started with a letter slipped under my door. Thick stationery, the HOA logo embossed at the top, and Karen's signature at the bottom. Dear Dr. Hale, your mailbox is under review for potential violation of Section 7.3.4 pending board deliberation. Please refrain from further modifications until inspection is complete. Failure to comply may result in escalated enforcement. I nearly laughed myself hoarse. Escalated enforcement? What was she going to do, bring a bulldozer this time? I scanned the letter, highlighted the vague legalese, and dropped it into my evidence folder. Every piece of paper, every word from her mouth was more rope she was handing me to hang her case. That evening, Frank and I sat on his porch, beers in hand, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. She's rattled, he said. You saw her face in there. That wasn't the queen bee anymore. That was a cornered wasp. She'll sting harder before she dies, I muttered. Frank chuckled. Good thing your mailbox is wasp-proof. We both laughed, but we knew the game wasn't over. Karen's pride was on the line, and pride is more dangerous than power. Sure enough, the very next evening her SUV rolled up again. This time she wasn't alone. Her husband sat stiffly in the passenger seat, and two men in neon vests, the maintenance crew, trailed behind in a pickup. And there, in Karen's perfectly manicured hand, gleamed the infamous pipe wrench. I stepped onto my porch before they even had the chance to climb out. Evening, I said cheerfully, as though they were neighbors dropping by for iced tea. Need directions, Karen's smirk returned, brittle but determined. We're here to conduct an inspection. Your mailbox is atypical. Funny, I said, because atypical isn't in the covenant. Care to show me where it says a mailbox can't be reinforced? She ignored me and motioned to her husband. He hesitated, wrench dangling awkwardly at his side. Go on, she hissed. The man looked at me then, at the growing crowd of neighbors, gathering with phones out. Even the Ruiz kids were chanting under their breath, mailbox, mailbox. He shifted his weight, then muttered, Karen, maybe this isn't. Now she snapped. That was my cue. I stepped forward, holding my phone high. Let me remind you all, tampering with a mailbox is a felony under federal law. I've already spoken with the postal inspector. And as you can see, I pointed to the oak tree where my hidden camera's red light blinked. This entire incident is being recorded. Attempt it, and you're not just facing me. You're facing the United States Postal Service and a court of law. Karen froze. Her face went from crimson to pale in a heartbeat. Her husband lowered the wrench like it weighed 50 pounds. The maintenance crew shuffled uncomfortably, one of them finally saying, Mrs. Monroe, it meets the guidelines. We shouldn't touch it. From across the street, Frank let out a belly laugh. That mailbox ain't moving, lady. Not today, not ever. The neighbors clapped, their voices rising like a chorus. Mrs. Harris shouted, Leave him alone, while Dorothy recorded with her iPad, zooming in dramatically as if she were filming a courtroom drama. Karen turned on her heel, eyes blazing. This is harassment, she shrieked. No, I said calmly. This is accountability. And if you'd like to test that in court, I'll be happy to meet you there. Oh, and don't forget to refund that $150 removal fee you stole from me. Her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. Then, without another word, she stormed back to her SUV husband, scurrying behind maintenance crew, retreating like soldiers abandoning a lost battle. The engine roared, tires screeched, and just like that, she was gone. The applause that followed shook the block. It wasn't polite clapping, it was cathartic, jubilant, the sound of people realizing they'd been freed from a tyrant's shadow. For the first time, Cedar Glen felt like a community instead of a kingdom. But I wasn't naive. I knew Karen's defeat on the street didn't mean she was finished. People like her don't step down gracefully. They scheme, they regroup, they plot comebacks. And sure enough, the very next morning, flyers appeared in every mailbox except mine, of course. Emergency HOA meeting addressing the threat to neighborhood standards. Threat. That was me. The flyer was filled with Karen's trademark melodrama claims about aggressive homeowners undermining the HOA warnings. That failure to comply would tank property values, and a dramatic flourish about preserving the character of Cedar Glen. It read less like a notice and more like a campaign speech. I almost admired her tenacity. Almost. I knew what she was doing, rallying her loyalists, trying to spin the narrative before she lost control completely. So I did what she least expected. I went door to door, not with threats or rants, but with facts. I showed neighbors the covenant clause explained the federal law and reminded them of their own horror stories. I wasn't just fighting for my mailbox anymore. I was fighting for them. And it worked. One by one, people nodded, voices hushed but firm. She fined me for my shutters. She made me tear up my garden. She told me my kids couldn't chalk on the sidewalk. By the time the emergency meeting rolled around, the community center was packed to bursting. Karen sat at the head table, gavel in hand, eyes sweeping the crowd with forced confidence. But the sea of faces staring back at her wasn't the docile herd she was used to. This was an audience ready for blood. She cleared her throat. This meeting is called to address a homeowner's attempt to circumvent HOA authority with an unauthorized structure. It's not unauthorized, a voice shouted from the back. It was Mr. Ruiz holding up a copy of the covenant. It's exactly within the rules. Karen slammed the gavel. Out of order, Funny, I said, rising to my feet. That's what you said when you destroyed my mailbox without notice. Out of order, the room erupted. Cheers claps, even a few boos aimed squarely at Karen. She pounded the gavel again, but the sound was drowned out by voices rising against her. Bill Ortega, the lawyer board member, finally stood. His voice cut through the noise like a scalpel. We cannot ignore what has happened here. Federal law supersedes HOA regulations. Selective enforcement is not only unfair, it's illegal. I recommend we dismiss all violations related to Dr. Hale's mailbox and conduct an internal review of board practices immediately. The cheers that followed nearly lifted the roof. Karen's face crumpled. For the first time, she looked small. I leaned into the microphone. You wanted a fight, Karen. You got one. And you lost. The crowd roared. That night, as I walked home under the streetlights, my mailbox gleamed like a sentinel at the curb. Solid, unshakable. Karen might still have schemes left, but one thing was certain: her reign was cracking. And all it took to start the collapse was a box of steel, a little concrete, and a neighborhood that finally remembered how to stand together. The so-called emergency meeting might have ended with cheers, but its aftershocks rippled through Cedar Glen like an earthquake. For years, people had tiptoed around Karen, whispering complaints behind drawn curtains, paying fines without a fight. Now, for the first time, they'd seen her cornered, her voice drowned out, her gavel powerless. And that kind of moment doesn't vanish overnight. It plants seeds. Seeds of rebellion. 3 days later, I found one of those seeds on my doorstep, a petition. Dorothy from 2 streets over, an elderly widow whose bird bath had been removed because it was supposedly 2 inches too tall, had drafted a recall notice. She'd typed it on an old manual typewriter, each letter uneven, smudged with ink, but the words carried more weight than anything I'd seen in the covenant. We, the undersigned homeowners of Cedar Glen, hereby demand a vote to recall HOA President Karen Monroe due to selective enforcement, misuse of authority, and violations of governing documents. I ran my fingers over the page. Underneath Dorothy's shaky signature were 20 other names scrawled with determination. Frank's was there, bold and underlined. The Ruiz family signed as a unit. Even shy Mrs. Whitaker had added her careful script. By the end of that week, there were 50. Karen, of course, didn't take it quietly. She stormed into people's yards, railing about slander and defamation. She banged on doors, demanding neighbors rescind their signatures. But each confrontation only hardened the community's resolve. One neighbor told me, she hissed, "Do you know who you're dealing with?" And the man replied, "Yeah, a bully with a clipboard." He signed the petition twice, just out of spite. Meanwhile, I was gathering my final piece of insurance federal acknowledgement. The postal inspector's office had received my complaint weeks earlier, but now they sent a letter confirming they were reviewing the matter. I knew that didn't mean Karen was headed to prison tomorrow, but it was an official stamp, something tangible I could hold up at any meeting and say, "This isn't just my word. Uncle Sam is watching too." The recall meeting was set for a Thursday evening in late September. The community center overflowed, folding chairs crammed together, people standing against the walls. Even folks who'd never bothered with HOA politics before turned up. The air buzzed with anticipation. It felt less like a meeting and more like a trial, or maybe a revolution. Karen walked in late, her blazer sharper than ever, lips pursed so tight they looked painful. She carried a thick binder under one arm and slammed it on the head table with a theatrical thud. Her husband trailed behind her, pale and silent as always. Bill Ortega, the retired lawyer board member, cleared his throat. Tonight's agenda is a vote of confidence regarding the presidency of the Cedar Glen HOA. Karen leapt up before he could finish. "Before we begin this circus," she snapped, "let me remind everyone I have dedicated myself to protecting your property values. Without me, this neighborhood would fall into chaos. We'd have mismatched paint colors, basketball hoops littering the streets, and unsightly gardens dragging down our community's reputation. Do you want that?" The silence that followed wasn't supportive. It was heavy, suffocating, like the pause before thunder cracks. Then, a voice from the back, Dorothy's voice, rang out. "What I want is my birdbath back." Laughter erupted, echoing off the beige walls. Karen's face flushed. "This is serious business. So is running over mailboxes." Frank shot back, standing tall with his arms crossed. "And you broke the law doing it." He pointed toward me. "This man has the proof." All eyes turned my way. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. I didn't need theatrics, just facts. I opened my folder, held up the highlighted covenant, the photos, the witness statements. My voice carried steady and calm. Karen Monroe destroyed my mailbox 3 times. She fined me for replacing it. She claimed she followed procedure, but our covenant page 47 section 14.2 says otherwise. She failed to deliver written notice, failed to allow a cure period, and took unlawful action. And here I held up the letter from the postal inspector, his acknowledgement that interfering with mail delivery is a federal offense. She put all of us at risk by overstepping her authority. Gasps rippled through the room. Karen tried to interrupt, but Bill raised a hand, silencing her. And it's not just me, I continued. It's Mrs. Harris, whose shutters she targeted, the Ruiz family, whose Christmas lights were fined, Dorothy, whose birdbath vanished. This isn't enforcement, this is harassment. The crowd erupted. Cheers, stomps, shouts of, "Enough!" Karen banged her gavel until the plastic cracked, but no one listened. Finally, Bill stood. We will proceed with the vote. Ballots were distributed, simple slips of paper with 2 boxes, retain or recall. People lined up, dropped their votes into a cardboard box at the front. The room buzzed like a hive. Karen sat, rigid eyes darting like a trapped animal, muttering under her breath. When the last ballot was counted, Bill cleared his throat. By a margin of 72-9, the community has voted to recall Karen Monroe as HOA president. The eruption that followed was unlike anything I'd ever seen in Cedar Glen. People clapped, hugged, even whistled. Dorothy wiped tears from her eyes. Frank lifted his beer in salute. The Ruiz kids whooped so loudly their parents shushed them, but no one really cared. Karen stood, face white as paper. "You'll regret this," she hissed. Then she stormed out, husband trailing like a ghost. For the first time in years, the community center felt alive. We weren't just neighbors anymore, we were a coalition. The following week, Bill Ortega was elected the new president. He stood on my driveway one morning, hands in his pockets, looking at my bulletproof mailbox with something like admiration. "You know," he said, "in 20 years of practicing law, I never thought a mailbox would topple a tyrant." "Neither did I admitted. "But here we are." He chuckled. "Sometimes it only takes one person refusing to back down. You gave everyone else permission to do the same." I looked at the mailbox gleaming in the morning sun, brass numbers catching the light. It wasn't just a box for bills and junk mail anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that standing up even over something small can ripple out into something much bigger. As weeks passed, more neighbors began upgrading their mailboxes. Not all went full Fort Knox like me, but several installed reinforced posts or sturdier boxes. The local paper even ran a feature titled "Mailbox Revolt in Cedar Glen: How One Homeowner Stood Against the HOA." Karen. She faded into obscurity. Rumor had it she tried to start a new HOA in another subdivision, but word traveled fast. Nobody wanted a president who thought vandalism was governance. And me, I still come home after long hospital shifts, tired but satisfied, and smile every time I see that indestructible green box waiting for me. It doesn't just hold my mail, it holds the story of the day Cedar Glen finally remembered that the HOA works for us, not the other way around. In the weeks after the recall, Cedar Glen felt like a neighborhood reborn. The air was lighter, people waved more, kids left their basketball hoops out without fear of fines. Dorothy put her birdbath back on her lawn, this time with a bright pink ribbon tied around it, a mocking tribute to the violation slips Karen used to hand out. Every time I walked my dog down the street, folks stopped me to say thanks, to swap stories, or to ask about the brand of my indestructible mailbox. It was almost funny. For years we'd all been living under this invisible fog of rules and intimidation, and the fog vanished overnight, and it all started with something as small as a mailbox. But even though Karen was gone, I wasn't about to let my guard down. I knew people like her. They rarely went quietly. They stew, they plot, and sometimes they come back swinging. That's why I kept my evidence folder neat and ready, updated with every new piece of correspondence from the board and the postal inspector's office. If she tried anything again, I'd be prepared. One crisp October morning, a plain white envelope arrived in my bulletproof mailbox. Inside was a check for $150, my removal fee refunded in full, and a typed note from the interim board: violation dismissed. "We apologize for the inconvenience, and thank you for your patience." I held it in my hand and laughed out loud. For weeks I dreamed about seeing Karen eat crow. This was the next best thing, the HOA admitting defeat, not in whispers, but on paper. I deposited that check the same afternoon. When the teller asked why I was grinning like a fool, I just said, "Long story. Let's just say the mailbox won." But the best part wasn't the money, it was the ripple effect. Within 2 weeks, 5 other residents had installed their own versions of Fortress mailboxes. Some were steel like mine, others just reinforced posts, but the message was clear. Cedar Glen was done with intimidation. The Ruiz kids painted theirs bright green and jokingly called it the tank, Mrs. Harris's son installed a reinforced model for her, and she proudly showed it off like a trophy. Frank naturally went overboard. His mailbox was so heavily reinforced that one neighbor quipped it looked like it could survive a hurricane. The local paper caught wind of it and ran a feature with the headline, "Mailbox Rebellion, How a Neighborhood Stood Up to Its HOA." The photo was priceless, me, Frank, and Dorothy standing proudly beside my mailbox, while Karen's SUV drove by in the background, her face barely visible through the tinted glass. For once, the story wasn't about fines or violations, it was about neighbors standing together. And that felt better than any victory in court ever could. Karen's downfall was swift after that. The recall election had stripped her of her title, but she couldn't resist one last act of defiance. Rumor spread that she tried to call the County Code Enforcement Office, insisting our bulletproof mailboxes violated local ordinances. The officer apparently laughed and told her, "If it meets USPS guidelines, there's nothing we can do." After that, she disappeared. Some said she tried to worm her way into another subdivision's HOA, but word traveled quickly. Nobody wanted her brand of leadership. She'd gone from queen bee to neighborhood pariah in less than a month. One evening, I spotted her SUV idling at the stop sign near my street. For a moment, I thought she might roll down the window, maybe even apologize. But she didn't. She just glared at my mailbox, revved her engine, and sped off. It was the last time I ever saw her in Cedar Glen. Life returned to normal, or at least our new version of normal. Bill Ortega was elected HOA president, and he promised transparency and fairness. Meetings actually felt like discussions instead of interrogations. The board stopped nitpicking over nonsense and focused on real issues, landscaping, safety maintenance. People showed up not out of fear, but because they wanted to help. And me, I went back to long shifts at the hospital, the kind that left me exhausted but satisfied. But every time I pulled into my driveway, that gleaming green fortress at the curb greeted me. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore, it was a monument. Proof that sometimes the smallest battles can change everything. One night my mailman left me a handwritten note. "Most secure box on my route. Wish I had one at home." I pinned it to my fridge, smiling every time I saw it. Did I ever expect my biggest neighborhood battle to be fought over a mailbox? No. But that's the thing about life. Sometimes it's the smallest things that reveal the biggest truths. And here's what I learned. Bullies thrive on silence. They grow strong when people look the other way, mutter under their breath, or tell themselves it's not worth the fight. Karen had power not because she deserved it, but because no one had stood up to her. Once someone did, her empire crumbled. The mailbox was just the spark. The real fire came from neighbors realizing they didn't have to take it anymore. That they had the right to their homes, their yards, their bird baths, and basketball hoops, and that together they were stronger than one woman with a gavel and an SUV. I hope anyone hearing this story remembers that. Whether it's a mailbox, a yard sign, or something much bigger, don't let petty tyrants push you around. Stand up, document everything, find your allies. And when you plant your flag or your mailbox, make sure it's so solid no one can knock it down. So yes, my mailbox is bulletproof. But more importantly, so is my neighborhood now. And every time I walk past it, I'm reminded it might not stop bullets, but it stopped Karen. And that's enough. At the end of it all, the lesson wasn't about mailboxes, fines, or even Karen. It was about courage, the courage to say no when someone abuses their authority, and the courage to stand together when one voice alone feels too small. Too often we underestimate the power of small acts of defiance. But the truth is, those acts ripple outward. My fight over a mailbox inspired a neighborhood to reclaim its dignity. In life, you'll meet people who thrive on control, who feed on intimidation. Don't let them. Don't roll your eyes and let it slide. Stand your ground even if it's over something that seems trivial, because it's never just about the thing, it's about the principle behind it. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below. Have you ever had to stand up to a bully, HOA, or otherwise? And don't forget to hit subscribe, because trust me, there are plenty more HOA nightmares and victories where this one came from.